Okay, we're starting recording. So we're going to let me just talk a little bit about the research paper just to make sure that you're very clear. So you can really pretty much pick any topic you want, something that interests you, something that piques your interest, and tie it into the class. That's the main thing, is to tie it to the class material. Now, we've talked about the work of many revolutionary artists, revolutionary cultural movements. We're talking about the Mexican mural movement, women's art in Mexico, a lot of different aspects of this, the Zapatistas. Now we're beginning to talk about the Cuban Revolution. You can look at Latino art in the United States, Nicaragua. So these are all ways you can tie it in, or you can kind of look at the experience or the impact of these artists on other art movements. One woman was talking about comparing the role of women in Latin America to the role of women in Japan, and using art as a way of focusing on this. So again, it's very open in terms of what the topics are. I want you to find something that you're passionate about and find a way to tie it to the class material. So is that clear? And you can be brave in terms of what you do. And I really want this to be a way for you to reflect on your own experience, your own studies, your own research, and kind of tie it to the elements in the class. So is that clear? Anybody have any questions? Anybody want to throw out their topic just to share it with us? How about you, Tatiana?
I don't have so much of a topic. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't have so much of a topic as of now. I am interested in doing research on Fernando Botero.
Uh-huh.
I know he has had a lot of impact in Colombia, and especially during the drug war in Colombia. So I don't know if I'm trying to figure out a way to tie it into what we've learned in the class.
Well, Botero, there's a few interesting things about Botero's work. One is, first, he derives a lot of his inspiration from folk art, mm-hmm. right? And if you look at the shape of the figures, mm-hmm. he's again contrasting the real way that people look, right? Mm-hmm. These rounded bodies, rather mm-hmm. than the people we see in magazines and reality shows, right? So that's one thing. He's kind of reclaiming, the same way that Diego Rivera was protagonizing working people, he's kind of showing what Latin American people look like and kind of celebrating Latin American identity in that way. Another way is he's using those folk art techniques to look at modern themes. For instance, you could look at the exhibit that he did at UC Berkeley of the Abu Ghraib atrocities, right? Again, he looked at the torture of prisoners in Iraq. So that he uses his art to focus on contemporary themes, such as he did in Colombia also. So this is a real innovation, and something very similar to many of what the Mexican artists were trying to do. But he's putting it in a modern focus, but he's maintaining the folk art techniques. So these are some of the things you can look at, like how he's trying to maintain a very, or create a very Latin American aesthetic, right? Okay. Mm-hmm. And this is something you see all over Latin America in folk art, and they call this las gordas, and it's just these very rounded bodies and the way people really look, which I think is an important contribution. If you see that movie, Real Women Have Curves, kind of, it's the same theme, that you shouldn't be ashamed of the way you look. This is how people look, and it's that consumer capitalism has created these models and the ideals that don't really correspond to the way people look, right? So it's a commentary about consumer culture also, and the power of advertising and kind of counteracting that.
Okay.
Yeah. So these are things you could look at. And I think this is a great topic. I've read a lot of essays about him, and I think you won't have any trouble finding resources, because also his time at UC Berkeley, at the museum there, was very well documented. and people wrote a lot of things about him there, so you could find them. So if you need more time, go ahead and just ask me. Take more time. Also,
Okay.
the UC Santa Cruz librarians
Mhm.
know a lot about this stuff and have a lot of sources. You can harass them. You can contact them and say, look, I need this, and help me find that. And they will, because they've done this before. I've been teaching this class for a while, so they know.
Okay, alrighty, I'll do that then.
Yeah, you can just, you can either send them an email or just type in Fernando Bortero, and you're going to find a ton of articles, especially around the Abu Ghraib, because this was something that people wrote about. A lot of this other stuff is published in Latin America, which might be hard to access. But the UC Berkeley stuff there's a lot of it, and it's all there. Anybody else?
Thank you.
Sure. Anyone else?
I have a question just about the research part.
Uh-huh.
So it said 2 text sources.
Right.
So do we have to go out and go on the web to look at stuff, or can we use the sources from the class?
You can use the sources from the class. This was an anti-Wikipedia measure, just to get people to actually look at books rather than fridakahlo.com. It's kind of a lame attempt for me to push you to open some books, but I'm not, whatever sources you can find, and I trust that that you're going to go past the Wikipedia and the fridakahlo.com. The problem with finding sources online is many of them aren't really academic sources. They're just trying to sell you something. So you look at the bottom, oh yeah, order your Frida t-shirts or your, tour of this or that. So that there's some kind of commercial motive to it, and they're not really academic sources. So that's what that's about. I'm not really a stickler about it, but I'm just trying to push you to use some books, right? And the librarians also asked me to include that kind of thing, just to get you to go to the library or even look on their online site. And the UCSC McHenry Library has ridiculous amount of sources and a periodical database. So if you just do a search, you're going to find materials really easily. So anybody else? Any questions, comments? Want to throw your research paper out there? Topic? Nobody else? Okay.
I have a question. If we have images that we want to include, should we add that to the the bibliography, or in the paper?
Put it in the paper.
Okay.
Yeah. It's easier. It's more fun for me to read it that way, because I'm seeing it, I'm reading about it. It just makes it easier.
And you did ask for us to create a bibliography, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's kind of just an exercise, because this is something you do in college. This is what you do. And it's just to keep in the habit. I'm not going to be a super stickler about the format and all that, but it's just that's what you do. And it's creating a trail so that researchers that come behind you can follow your path if they want to take it further. Right. And that's anybody else? Well, let me talk a little bit about Cuba. And what this is about. So the Cuban Revolution really begins in 1952. We can see Cuba there's a reform movement in Cuba, as in much of Latin America, a nationalist government making some small inroads in land reform. After World War II, the expectations of Latin American people have been raised, and they're trying to make some changes and to try to avoid the unrest that we've seen in other parts of the world. We see liberation movements breaking out all over the world after World War II, in Africa, in Asia, all through Latin America. We see a lot of people moving towards trying to create a democratic opening and to ease the economic inequality. In 1952, we see a dictator, Fulgencio Batista, takes power in Cuba through a military coup. to try to put aside these land reforms with the support of the United States. And if you watch the movie The Godfather 2, you can see it kind of documents the way the mafia, the American mafia, used this as a wedge to get into Cuba. They had a strong presence going back to the Prohibition in the 1920s when alcohol was prohibited in the United States. Americans would go to Cuba to drink, right? There were shuttles and ferries from Florida. People would go down there to party on the weekends, and a lot of these clubs that opened that catered to the Americans were also linked to the American mafia and organized crime. So in the 1950s, the American mafia makes deals with Fulgencio Batista, and they became the owners and operators of many of the new hotels, casinos, nightclubs that opened in Havana. And Fidel Castro in 1953, just graduating from law school, sees that it's going to be impossible in Cuba to have a democratic system or to even be a lawyer or pursue the law in a dictatorship where there is no law, that it's by decree. And he leads an uprising of students to attack a military barracks, the Moncada barracks in Santiago. And this is very significant because university students are seen as the elite. They're very privileged, right? Not everyone can be a university student. And they feel that students leading this insurrection will provoke a popular uprising. So, of course, they're students and they're not soldiers. The attack is unsuccessful. Most of them some are killed, others are arrested. And they're finally, because of the uproar that their families make, and again, across the country, why would students do something like this? They want to silence them, and they're exiled to Mexico, where they begin to organize a guerrilla movement to return to Cuba. And this is where they meet Che Guevara, who's a young medical student who's in Mexico at the time, who's been traveling through Latin America and starting to see the injustice, the inequality throughout Latin America. And they begin to explore the new possibilities of a guerrilla movement. And Guevara goes with them as a doctor, because as a medical student, he has some training. So they invade Cuba. They have a small yacht called the Granma in 1956. They decide to go to Cuba, and they're planning to meet with a group of comrades who are organizing. And again, they're not sailors, they're not soldiers. They land in the wrong place on the wrong day. They're ambushed, and out of the 82 people that on the boat, only 12 survive. And those 12 were able to regroup. They don't hook up with their comrades. The 12 were able to regroup and retreat into the Sierra Maestra Mountains, a remote mountain range close by there, and begin this guerrilla movement. And what's amazing about this is that these 12 people are able to survive in the mountains and to organize the peasants in the mountains and to create a guerrilla army that's able to defeat the Batista army in a period of 3 years. So they're using their moral example. They're able to convince people of the justness of their cause and get people to sign up to join the guerrilla movement. So in 1959, the guerrillas marched triumphantly into Havana, defeating Batista's army. The dictator flees with the national treasury and leaves behind his supporters, and we see the revolution begins. And the Cuban Revolution marks a very strong change in Latin America, because this is a group who's able to take power through force, but similar to the Russian Revolution and the revolution in China, that they come into it with a very clear idea of reforming the system from the bottom up. So some of the first reforms that they put into place are rent control. They slash rents by 50%. They nationalize properties, and a series of acts to equalize the distribution system. One of the things that we look at is during this time of, and we see the opposition of the United States right away, United States, which has a controlling interest in much of Cuba's industries, they began to react against it, to move against the Cuban Revolution through armed invasions of supporting terrorist groups. And we see Cuba moving towards the Soviet bloc. So one of the first conversations that goes on, mostly they're economic conversations, but one of the first conversations is Fidel with the intellectuals, the artists, the writers, the painters, musicians, dancers, filmmakers. They say, well, what about us? What's the role of culture and art going to be in this revolution? And Fidel probably hadn't thought about this very much, but here he is surrounded by hundreds of intellectuals. And he says, well, within the revolution, everything. Outside the revolution, nothing. Now, what does this mean? This is very vague, because how do you define what's inside and what's outside? But they took this as a way of pursuing a new forms of revolutionary art, and to make themselves kind of critics of injustice wherever they saw it. So one of the things that Che Guevara did was to introduce the idea that in this new society, within the revolution, that change could only happen. The revolution would only be successful not with just the reform of the economic, political, and social system, but a reform of the way people treated each other on a one-to-one basis. And this is almost a Christian, a Catholic concept, that people needed to transform the way that they treat each other on a one-to-one basis, that these revolutionary values need to be embodied in each person and in each interaction. So it's not just that the system be reformed, but each person kind of internalize and assimilate these ideas. So Che's idea was to create a society without money, where the material needs would be met, but that people wouldn't try to accumulate property, and they would kind of create an egalitarian system where money would disappear as the motivation for being productive citizens, so that there would be a spiritual reward rather than a material reward. And this is very hard to conceive how you would have a society without money. Why would you go to work if you don't get paid, right? And why would you work harder if you don't get paid more? So, but his idea was to create a society where people would sacrifice for the benefit of others. So also to identify injustice wherever it's seen. So many of the artists originally began with these concepts of Che and began criticizing hypocrisy within the system, within the revolution. They took Fidel's words to heart. So you can see some of the early films are very critical of bureaucrats, of authoritarian figures, of the system in general, pointing out the hypocrisy and also the existential crisis that people are facing in having to sacrifice their own needs for the needs of others. The idea of being, being part of a family, you have to sacrifice for your brothers and sisters and things like that. You have to give up some of your own needs. And on a collective basis, this is an existential crisis that everybody faces, trying to live within this and to become this new person, to create this new society. So we can see that Cuban art begins with a series of contradictions. So the generation of the 80s that emerges in Cuban art, and Cuba institutes a huge cultural education program, building art schools, arts education, promoting professional artists, giving them a subsidy to create art. And their only job was to create art that's meaningful to people. But what does that mean? Again, we can see discussions going on because there's always conflict between the artist and the arts administrator, the person who administers the gallery and the artists that are creating the work, the museum directors, etc. So we can see these conflicts arising. So by the 1980s, we see a group of revolutionary artists who've been trained within the revolutionary art schools but aren't finding ways to distribute their art. They're finding contradictions and conflicts with government administrators and bureaucrats. So much of the generation of the 80s feels that their access to the public is being closed off, and they begin to resort to alternative ways of showing their art. They have rooftop galleries, gatherings, public art, performance art, all kinds of ways. And also they've reached a level of technical skill, because students who begin in the art school at 8 years old, by the time they're 20, they've been studying every day for 12 years and have become very proficient technically. And again, they have some great teachers who are pushing them always to be better, to be better, to be better, to be relevant. Anyway, so the generation of the 80s, many of them ended up leaving Cuba because they found that there was a huge demand for their art. They could be wealthy, they could be very successful in other countries, where in Cuba they were stymied. So many of this generation left. A lot of them are returning now that things have changed. But we can see many dilemmas, and Cuban art has always been critical. Now, the concept of censorship, there was censorship in the 1960s, but much of this disappeared by the mid-70s, overt censorship, to a more subtle form of censorship where access was difficult for many of the more critical artists. So these are things that you'll read about in the chapter. You can look at some of the forms of public art in Cuba, like poster art. Very different, because in a tropical country, muralism is not as easy because it rains and it's hard for paint to dry, and there aren't as many walls and things like that. So many of the Cuban artists used poster art, which is a form of public art, especially silkscreen poster art. And this poster art also influenced the Chicano movement in the United States, that they were about certain themes and using bright colors and kind of creating new aesthetics in public art. So you can look at innovations in music, in theater, in dance, poetry, literature. Casa de las Americas in Cuba becomes the center of Latin American culture in the 1960s. This is a cultural center that's created for Latin America, Casa de las Americas. And it's where Gabriel Garcia Marquez's first works are published. Pablo Neruda, Victor Jara, many of Latin America's great painters, poets, and writers are hosted there. So you can look at that. So anybody have any other questions? I'm kind of hurrying up now because as you can see, I have this, and it's hard to sit here. Anybody have any questions or comments and about this? So do the readings. I think the Art and Revolution chapter is very clear and makes a lot of these points. You can see in the videos that I've posted a lot of information. And I look forward to reading your research papers very soon. And if you have any comments or any questions or any doubts, feel free. We can also have a one-on-one video conference whenever you want. I'm pretty available. I can't drive, so I'm sitting home just healing. So feel free, reach out to me, and we'll talk soon. Anybody have anything else? Okay, great. Thank you so much. I appreciate you coming to this. It means a lot that you take the time to share with me and to be a part of this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.